Clearwater Shores, Florida. A town where time seemed to stand still, where the air carried the scent of fresh salt water, and the sound of waves crashing against the shore was as familiar as the laughter of children playing in the streets. It was the kind of place where mornings began with the aroma of fresh coffee brewing in cozy diners, and evenings ended with families gathered on their porches, watching the sun disappear beyond the horizon. Here, life moved at a slow and steady pace. Neighbors knew each other by name. Strangers were greeted with warm smiles. People left their doors unlocked, convinced that nothing bad could ever truly happen in a place like this. After all, Clearwater Shores was a paradise, a safe haven tucked away from the chaos of the outside world. At the very heart of this quiet coastal town was Sheriff Julia Monroe. She wasn't just another officer in uniform. She was the law in Clearwater Shores, the one who kept the streets safe, the one who showed up when people needed her the most, the one parents pointed to when teaching their children about strength and integrity. She wasn't just respected. She was admired. Julia had spent her entire career protecting the people of this town. She had caught thieves, solved disappearances, and faced down dangerous criminals. Her name was synonymous with justice, but she never could have imagined that the greatest threat wouldn't come from an outsider. It wouldn't come from a stranger lurking in the shadows or a criminal passing through. No, the greatest danger, the darkest evil, was inside her own home. It was a sweltering July afternoon in 2024 when everything changed. The summer sun hung high in the sky, baking the sidewalks, making the air thick and heavy with heat. Most people had retreated indoors, seeking relief from the oppressive warmth, their ceiling fans humming softly as they watched television or took midday naps. Julia Monroe had spent the morning handling routine calls, an argument between neighbors over a property line, a lost dog found wandering near the pier, a speeding ticket issued to a teenager driving his father's car a little too fast. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary day, or at least, it should have been. Around noon, Julia decided to head home for a break. Just an hour, maybe two. Just enough time to grab a cold drink, take off her boots, and sit in the comfort of her air-conditioned house before heading back to work. She had no reason to expect anything unusual. No reason to suspect that, in a matter of moments, her entire world was about to shatter. The moment Julia stepped inside, she felt it. A shift, a wrongness in the air. Something she couldn't quite place, but something her instincts recognized immediately. Years of police work had honed her senses to detect danger, to pick up on the little things that most people would ignore. A door slightly ajar when it should have been closed. The way the house was too quiet. Not the peaceful silence she was used to, but an unnatural stillness. She took another step forward, scanning the living room. Nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was exactly as she had left it that morning. The framed family photos on the wall, her, Ryan, and Lily smiling in moments that now felt like another lifetime, remained untouched. Still, something felt wrong. Her breath hitched slightly as she called out, "Ryan? Lily?" No answer. Her heartbeat quickened, the weight of unease settling deep in her chest. Maybe they had gone out for ice cream. Maybe Ryan had taken Lily to the beach for a swim, a way to escape the suffocating heat of the afternoon. But then, she noticed something. Ryan's truck, still in the driveway. Her pulse pounded in her ears. If Ryan was still home, why wasn't he answering? She stepped further inside, closing the door behind her. Every nerve in her body was on high alert now. She wasn't just Julia Monroe, the sheriff of Clearwater Shores anymore. She was a mother whose gut was screaming that something was very wrong. What happened next would send shockwaves through the town. It would ignite a national firestorm. And it would force Julia Monroe to make a choice that no amount of training, no years of law enforcement experience, could have ever prepared her for. A choice that would change everything. Asterisk. Before the tragedy, before the headlines, before the trial, before the world knew her name, Julia Monroe was something else entirely. She was a protector, a leader, a mother, and above all, she was a survivor. From the outside looking in, Julia had the perfect life. A respected career, a loving husband, a bright and beautiful daughter. But what most people didn't know, what no one ever asked, was how much she had endured to build that life. Because Julia Monroe wasn't born into law enforcement. She fought her way in. She was raised in one of the roughest neighborhoods in Miami, a place where sirens were more common than birdsong, where gunshots echoed through the night like distant fireworks. Crime wasn't just something she heard about, it was something she lived through. Her father, Luis Monroe, was a hard-working construction worker, the kind of man who came home every evening with dust-covered boots and calloused hands. He wasn't wealthy, but he made sure his family never went without. To Julia, he was a giant, a man who seemed invincible, until the day he wasn't. She was 14 when it happened. Her father had stopped at a corner store on his way home, like he had done hundreds of times before. A simple errand, a carton of milk, a loaf of bread. Nothing extraordinary. But that night, there was someone else inside the store. A man with a gun. The robbery should have ended in a few stolen dollars. But a nervous finger on a trigger changed everything. Julia never got to say goodbye. She remembered the way her mother collapsed when the police knocked on their door. She remembered the funeral, the weight of loss settling over her like a permanent shadow. She remembered the way the world kept moving, even when hers had stopped. And she remembered a promise she made to herself that day. She wouldn't let this happen to anyone else. The anger, the grief, it could have consumed her. Instead, it fueled her. She buried herself in her studies, refusing to let statistics define her future. The world expected her to fail. She was a poor girl from a crime-ridden neighborhood. But Julia Monroe didn't do what the world expected. She graduated high school top of her class. She joined the police academy the moment she turned 18. She trained harder than anyone else, ran faster, aimed sharper, thought quicker. While others hesitated, Julia ran toward danger. When recruits whispered that a woman wouldn't make it, she proved them wrong. When trainers threw obstacles in her path, she tore them down. She wasn't the strongest in the room. She wasn't the tallest. But she was the most determined. Her instructors noticed. She wasn't just good, she was exceptional. By the time she graduated, there was no question where she was headed. She was recruited into the Miami Police Department, working some of the toughest cases in the city. Drug busts, violent crime, missing persons. She saw it all. But the city was exhausting. The cases never stopped. And after years of staring into the worst of humanity, Julia found herself wondering, is this really the life I want? She dreamed of something different, a place where she could know the people she served, not just as cases but as neighbors, as friends. A town where she wouldn't have to worry about locking 3 deadbolts on her door every night. Then an opportunity came, a sheriff's position in a small, quiet town on the Florida coast, Clearwater Shores. It was a place she had only seen in postcards, palm trees swaying in the breeze, pristine beaches stretching for miles. A town so peaceful that the biggest police emergencies involved lost dogs and parking violations. Felt unreal. A place that safe? Could it really exist? Julia didn't hesitate. She packed her life into 2 suitcases, left the city behind, and stepped into a new world. But the town wasn't ready for her. A big city cop in their peaceful little bubble? Clearwater Shores wasn't convinced they needed someone like her. The people were polite but distant. They watched her, judged her, wondered if she'd last. But Julia was patient. She walked the streets, introduced herself, learned every name she could. She worked cases no one else wanted, helped the elderly fix broken fences, found a lost engagement ring for a panicked bride, took the time to listen. Slowly, things changed. The wary nods turned into friendly waves. The distant glances turned into warm conversations. And then, one day, they stopped calling her the new sheriff. She had become their sheriff. Within 5 years, she wasn't just Clearwater Shores law enforcement. She was part of its fabric. People trusted her. They needed her. She had built a life here, a life she was proud of, a life she had earned. And at the center of that life was her family. Ryan Walker had come into her life like a whirlwind, charming, confident, the kind of man who could light up a room with his presence. He was a high school football coach, beloved by students and parents alike. The kind of man people looked up to. They met at a community fundraiser. Julia had been off duty, dressed in jeans instead of her uniform, for once just another face in the crowd. She hadn't been looking for romance, but Ryan had a way of breaking down walls. The connection was instant. The whirlwind romance led to marriage. A beautiful beachside wedding, the entire town in attendance. And then Lily, their daughter, the light of Julia's life. To the world, the Monroe family was perfect. Julia was the tough but fair sheriff who kept the town safe. Ryan was the beloved coach who led the high school football team to victory. And Lily? She was their bright, bubbly daughter. All freckles and laughter, always running barefoot through the sand. Clearwater Shores adored them. People spoke of them with pride, pointed them out at town events like they were something special. And for a while, Julia believed it too. She believed that her past, the violence, the crime, the loss was behind her, that she had finally found a place where nothing bad could happen. She was wrong. Asterisk. From the outside looking in, the Monroe family was picture perfect. A sheriff, a football coach, a beautiful daughter. They were the kind of family people admired, respected, even envied. When Julia Monroe and Ryan Walker stood together, they looked like something out of a magazine. Her in her crisp sheriff's uniform, him in his school colors, Lily running between them with her golden hair catching the afternoon sun. To Clearwater Shores, they weren't just another family. They were the town's golden family. And that all started the day Julia met Ryan. It was a charity fundraiser, an event to support underprivileged youth in the community. Julia had been there in an official capacity, dressed in casual clothes but still wearing the unmistakable air of a woman who carried authority. Ryan, on the other hand, was in his element, laughing, shaking hands, telling stories that had the crowd hanging on his every word. He had that thing, that easy confidence, that natural charisma that made people gravitate toward him. And Julia noticed. She wasn't the type to be easily impressed, but there was something about him. The way he made people feel comfortable. The way he seemed to know exactly what to say at the right moment. Their first conversation was lighthearted. "So, Sheriff Monroe," he had said, flashing that signature smile, "do I have to behave extra well tonight? Or do I get one free pass?" Julia smirked, arms crossed. "That depends. You planning on causing trouble?" "Me? Never." A harmless exchange. A simple flirtation. But from that moment on, Ryan Walker became part of Julia's world. Their relationship moved fast. Whirlwind romance didn't even begin to describe it. Within months, they were inseparable. The serious, determined sheriff and the charming, beloved coach. Ryan proposed on the beach at sunset, the waves lapping at their feet. Julia had hesitated, not because she didn't love him, but because love had always felt fragile to her, like something that could be taken away in an instant. But Ryan had a way of making her believe that, maybe this time, things could be different. They were married that following summer. A gorgeous beachfront ceremony attended by nearly everyone in town. It was the kind of wedding people still talked about years later. The perfect vows, the way the sky turned golden just as they said, "I do." The way Ryan had swept Julia into his arms during their first dance. And then came Lily, their daughter, their pride and joy. If Julia had ever doubted that happiness was possible, Lily proved her wrong. From the moment she was born, Julia's world revolved around her. She was the mother who never missed a milestone. The mother who showed up to every soccer game, every recital, every school. She was the mother who never missed a milestone. The mother who showed up to every soccer game, every recital, every school play. The mother who held Lily's hand when she was sick, read her bedtime stories, and promised her she would always be safe. And Ryan, he was the fun parent. The one who let Lily stay up late watching movies, who carried her on his shoulders at the county fair, who taught her how to throw a football like one of his star players. To everyone who knew them, the Monroes had it all. A sheriff who kept the town safe. A coach who inspired the next generation. A daughter who was smart, kind, and full of life. Clearwater Shores adored them. People spoke about them with admiration. The way Julia and Ryan looked at each other. The way they doted on their daughter. They were the kind of family others aspired to be. But the thing about perfect pictures is that they can hide the cracks beneath them. And the cracks in the Monroe family were already forming. At first, they were so small, so imperceptible, that even Julia didn't notice them. But then, as Lily neared her 10th birthday, those cracks started to grow, and everything began to shift. Asterisk. They say the worst things in life don't happen all at once. They happen slowly, quietly, like a thread unraveling from the seam of a sweater, little by little, until one day, you look down and realize it's completely come apart. For Julia Monroe, the unraveling began with small things. Things so insignificant at first that she dismissed them as stress, exhaustion, or just life getting in the way. She had always worked long hours, but now, she started staying at the station even later. Not because she had more work to do, but because she found herself hesitating before going home. She told herself it was nothing. She was just tired. She was just busy. But deep down, something felt different. And then there was Ryan. First, his behavior seemed normal, thoughtful even. He started volunteering more to pick Lily up from school. Started putting her to bed every night. Started insisting that he be the one to handle everything related to her. From the outside, it looked like a father being more involved. Stepping up while his wife worked late. People in town even praised him for it. Ryan's such a great dad, they would say. Lily is lucky to have him. And maybe Julia would have believed that, too, if it weren't for the way he acted when she was around. The way he would stiffen when Julia walked into the room while he was alone with Lily. The way his voice would change, too calm, too measured, like someone who had something to hide. The way he started watching her, almost as if he were waiting to see if she noticed. Julia wasn't sure what she was noticing. She had spent years in law enforcement. She knew what real danger looked like. But this was different. It was a feeling, not a fact. And feelings weren't something she could act on. So she ignored it, kept her head down, kept moving forward. But what she couldn't ignore, what she wouldn't ignore, was Lily. Because Lily had changed. The little girl who used to fill their house with laughter, who used to run through the backyard barefoot chasing fireflies, who used to wake Julia up on Sunday mornings begging for pancakes, was gone. In her place was a quiet, withdrawn child. One who barely spoke at dinner. One who flinched when touched, even by her own mother. One whose bright, curious eyes had dimmed. At school, her teachers noticed, too. Her grades slipped. She stopped playing with her friends. Stopped raising her hand in class. Stopped being Lily. And when people asked her if everything was okay, she smiled. She lied. She said everything was fine. But in her eyes was fear. And Julia, for all her training, all her instincts, all her experience with crime and criminals, didn't see it. Not yet. Not until it was too late. Asterisk. The morning started like any other. Julia woke up before dawn, just as she always did. She moved through the house quietly, careful not to wake Lily. She brewed coffee, buttoned up her uniform, clipped on her badge. It was all part of a well-worn routine, one she had followed for years without thinking. As she sipped her coffee, she glanced over at the framed photo on the kitchen counter. The three of them, her, Ryan, and Lily, smiling on the beach, arms wrapped around each other. Perfect family. Or so it seemed. She had been doing that a lot lately, staring at old photos, looking for something, a sign, a clue, something to explain why things had started feeling so off. But she found nothing. So, she shook it off, told herself she was overthinking things, and walked out the door, leaving behind a home that would never be the same again. By noon, the Florida sun hung high in the sky, baking the sidewalks, making the air thick and heavy. Julia had just wrapped up a case, a simple noise complaint. Nothing urgent, nothing unusual. A normal day, until her phone rang. She pulled it from her pocket, expecting a work call. But the number on the screen made her pause. Lily's best friend's mother. Her stomach tensed as she answered. "Hey, Diane. Everything okay?" A hesitation on the other end. A beat too long. Then, "Is Lily feeling all right today?" Diane asked. "She never showed up for the playdate. I figured maybe she just forgot. But I've been calling, and no one's picking up." Julia frowned. "She never showed up?" "No. And I haven't seen Ryan either." That knot in Julia's stomach tightened. Ryan wasn't answering his phone either. Something was wrong. Her first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe Ryan had taken Lily somewhere and forgot to mention it. Maybe they were at the store or out for ice cream or at the beach. But that feeling, that same feeling that had been gnawing at her for months, was screaming at her now. Something wasn't right. Julia slid into her squad car, threw on her sirens, and sped toward home. She pressed redial. No answer. Again. No answer. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She was moving too fast, but she didn't care. By the time she turned onto her street, her pulse was hammering in her ears. And then, she saw it. Ryan's truck, parked in the driveway. Her chest constricted. He should have been at practice. Why was he still here? The heat of the afternoon suddenly felt suffocating. Julia pulled in beside the truck, killed the engine, and sat still for a moment, listening, watching. The house was silent. Too silent. Not the kind of silence that came when Lily was watching cartoons or playing in her room. Not the kind of silence that felt peaceful. This was something else. Something unnatural. Something wrong. Her instincts were screaming now. The air was thick, still, almost suffocating. Her eyes darted around the living room. Nothing was out of place. The furniture was the same. The framed family photos were untouched. But the atmosphere had changed. It was like stepping into a crime scene before the crime had been discovered. "Ryan?" she called out, her voice sharp. "Lily?" Nothing. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs. Then, a noise. From upstairs. Muffled. Indistinct. Her fingers brushed against the grip of her holstered weapon. She moved toward the stairs, her boots pressing into the carpeted steps. One by one, each creak of the wood beneath her sending a spike of adrenaline through her veins. She reached the top landing. The hallway stretched before her. The door to Lily's room was slightly ajar. And then she heard it, a sound she would never forget. A muffled whimper, a noise so soft yet so utterly wrong that it sent a bolt of ice through her bloodstream. Her breath hitched. She pushed the door open. And what she saw would haunt her forever. For a moment, time didn't exist. There was no before, no after, only now. Ryan's face twisted in shock as he spun toward Julia. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Maybe he was trying to explain. Maybe he was trying to lie. It didn't matter, because Julia had already seen everything. Lily, her baby, her bright, beautiful girl, was frozen in terror on the bed, her body rigid, her eyes wide with something deeper than fear, something broken. The monster standing beside her wasn't the man Julia had married. Wasn't the man she had once loved. No, that man had never existed. This was something else. Something sick. Something evil. Ryan lifted his hands slowly. "Julia," he began, voice shaking. "Listen to me." Her weapon was already in her hands. Her mind wasn't thinking. Her body was reacting. Years of training, years of instinct, it all funneled into this one single moment. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot shattered the silence. A sharp crack, louder than thunder, louder than anything she had ever heard. Ryan stumbled backward, eyes wide in disbelief as the bullet struck him in the chest. Then another, and another. 10 shots. For 10 years of Lily's life. Her hands didn't tremble. Her aim didn't falter. She fired until there was nothing left. Until the air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. Until the only sound in the room was the rapid, uneven rhythm of her own breathing. And then, silence. Ryan's body slumped to the ground, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the carpet, into the fibers of the home they had once shared. It was over, and yet it wasn't, because as the final echo of gunfire faded, reality crashed over her. She had just killed her husband, the father of her child, the man she had promised to love until death. She stood there, gripping the gun with white-knuckled fingers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, crushing her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her vision blurred, her legs buckled. She sank to the floor, her back against the wall, the still smoking gun slipping from her hands. She had protected her daughter. But at what cost? Asterisk. The gun was still warm in Julia's hands. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder, mingling with something metallic, something sharp, blood. Her ears were ringing, each pulse of sound pressing against her skull like an unbearable weight. It was as if the world had collapsed in on itself, as if everything around her had been sucked into a vacuum where time no longer existed. But there was one sound that cut through the suffocating silence like a blade. Sobbing, Julia turned, her breath shallow, her hands still trembling from the aftermath of the gunfire. And there she was, Lily, her daughter, her baby, curled in the corner of the bed, her tiny arms wrapped around her legs, her face buried between her knees. Her whole body was shaking. Julia had seen fear before. She had seen it in the eyes of battered women sitting in police interrogation rooms. She had seen it in the faces of lost children, wandering alone in grocery stores, crying for parents who weren't there. She had seen it in the expressions of men who had just been sentenced to life in prison, realizing they would never see the outside world again. But this was different. This was her daughter. And the way Lily was looking at her, it was like she didn't know whether to run into her mother's arms or run away from her. Julia's chest ached with the weight of it. She had done this. She had made this choice to protect Lily. So why did it feel like she had lost her? She took a step forward, arms reaching out. Lily, baby, it's okay. Lily flinched. Julia's stomach twisted. The breath left her lungs. She had seen that reaction before, victims of abuse. People who had been hurt by the ones they were supposed to trust. And now her own daughter was afraid of her. Her own daughter had watched her become something else. Not a mother. Not a sheriff. Not Julia Monroe. She had become something Lily didn't recognize. She had become death. The weight of that realization nearly crushed her. And then, the sirens. Distant at first, growing louder, screaming through the heavy Florida heat, cutting through the unnatural stillness of the house like a blade. She had called them. She didn't remember doing it. Didn't remember reaching for her radio, pressing the button, her voice eerily calm as she said the words, "This is Sheriff Monroe. Officer involved shooting. 214 Bayview Drive. Suspect is down." And now, they were coming. The first squad car skidded to a stop outside. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the house was surrounded. Flashing lights flooded through the windows. The front door burst open. Heavy boots pounded against the wooden floorboards as officers stormed inside. Julia recognized the voices. Deputy Carson, Officer Reynolds, men she had worked with for years. They had always looked up to her. And now they were looking at her like a suspect. Their weapons were raised. And she was standing in the middle of it all. Ryan's body bleeding out on the carpet, her gun still at her feet. "Sheriff!" Carson's voice cracked. What happened?" Julia's lips parted, but no words came out. She didn't have an answer, because how do you explain something like this? How do you explain this kind of horror? She didn't resist. She didn't fight. She just nodded, surrendering. Carson hesitated. Then he stepped forward. "Julia Monroe," he swallowed hard. "You're under arrest." The words felt like a gunshot to her chest. She had been the one to read those rights 100 times before. But this time, she was the one in handcuffs. Her wrists were pulled behind her back. The cold metal of the cuffs locked into place. She barely felt them. Her mind was somewhere else. On Lily, the little girl who was still curled in the corner, still shaking, still broken. The little girl she had just killed for. The little girl she wasn't sure would ever forgive her. The weight of it all finally crushed her. Her knees buckled. And as she was led out of the house, past the sea of flashing lights, past the officers who could barely look at her, she did something she hadn't done in years. She broke. And for the first time since she pulled that trigger, Julia Monroe wept. Asterisk. The moment the front door burst open, Julia barely flinched. She knew they were coming. She had heard the sirens screaming through the streets, growing closer, drowning out the sound of her own ragged breathing. Still, when the first officers rushed inside, weapons raised, eyes sharp, muscles tensed for confrontation, it felt unreal. For years, she had been on the other side of this moment. She had been the one charging into danger. She had been the one assessing the threat. And now, as she stood there in the center of it all, asterisk in the center of her own crime scene, asterisk she realized something chilling. She was the threat now. The men standing in her doorway, her deputies, her colleagues, her friends, froze at the sight in front of them. Ryan's lifeless body, the blood pooling beneath him, the gun still smoking in Julia's trembling hands. It was Deputy Carson who spoke first. "Sheriff." His voice cracked as he took a hesitant step forward. Julia didn't answer, because what could she say? That she had walked into a nightmare? That she had acted on pure instinct? That when she pulled that trigger, when she emptied every last bullet into the man she had once promised to love, she hadn't felt like a sheriff at all? She had felt like a mother protecting her child, a mother doing what needed to be done. She had no words, no defense, no explanation, so she just nodded, surrendering. Deputy Carson hesitated. His face was pale. He had worked alongside Julia for 5 years. He had respected her, looked up to her, trusted her. And now he was staring at her like he didn't even know who she was. Still, he took another step forward. Then another. "Julia Monroe." His voice was barely above a whisper. But when he spoke the next words, they were sharp. Final. "You're under arrest." The sentence hit her like a brick to the chest. She had been the one to read those rights 100 times before. But this time, she was the one in handcuffs. The cold steel snapped shut around her wrists, tight, unforgiving. She had cuffed countless criminals in her career. But never, not once, had she imagined what it would feel like to be on the receiving end. She barely felt her arms being pulled behind her back, barely heard the voices echoing around her, because all she could hear was Lily, her daughter's quiet, ragged breathing, the sound of tears hitting the floor. Julia turned her head slightly, just enough to see her. Lily was still in the corner, still curled in on herself, still trembling. Her small hands were gripping the fabric of her shirt so tightly, her knuckles had turned white. And the way she was looking at Julia shattered her. Lily wasn't just looking at her mother. She was looking at the woman who had just killed her father. And Julia realized something in that moment. Even though Ryan was dead, even though she had stopped the nightmare before it could go any further, she hadn't saved Lily. Not really, because Lily would never forget this moment. She would never unsee what she had seen. She would never again be that carefree little girl who ran barefoot through the sand, laughing, innocent, untouched by the darkness of the world. She had lost her father. And in a way, she had lost her mother, too. The realization nearly brought Julia to her knees. She had fought her entire life to keep people safe. And yet, standing here, surrounded by flashing lights and horrified stares, she felt like a failure. Like the one person she should have saved was already gone. A quiet voice broke through the chaos. Lily's voice, fragile. "Mommy." It was barely above a whisper. Julia turned fully now, ignoring the officers leading her toward the door. "Lily," she gasped, stepping toward her. But Carson's grip on her arm tightened. Julia snapped. "Let me go," she shouted, jerking against his hold. "I need to talk to her." Carson didn't budge. "Julia," he said, voice low, "you know I can't do that." She fought against the cuffs, the frustration, the gut-wrenching pain clawing at her insides. "Please," she whispered. It was the first time she had ever begged for anything. But it didn't matter. Carson's grip didn't loosen, and before Julia could say another word, she was being pulled toward the door, dragged out of her own home, away from her daughter, and the last thing she saw before the flashing lights swallowed her was Lily's face, her lips trembling, her hands reaching out, and her eyes, full of something Julia would never be able to erase. Not pain, not sadness, not even loss. Betrayal. Asterisk. The case of Julia Monroe v. The state of Florida became more than just a trial. It became a national obsession. Cable news networks ran hourly updates. Talk show hosts debated whether she was a murderer or a hero. The internet was flooded with opinions, theories, and heated arguments. Some called her a cold-blooded killer. She fired 10 risk. The case of Julia Monroe v. The state of Florida became more than just a trial. It became a national obsession. Cable news networks ran hourly updates. Talk show hosts debated whether she was a murderer or a hero. The internet was flooded with opinions, theories, and heated arguments. Some called her a cold-blooded killer. She fired 10 times. That's not self-defense. That's an execution. Others called her a mother who did what any parent would do. If that was my child, I wouldn't have stopped at 10. Outside the courthouse, the streets were chaos. Crowds gathered daily, some holding signs demanding justice for Ryan Walker, others carrying banners that read, "Free Julia." People who had never met her, never stepped foot in Clearwater Shores, never knew the horror of what she had seen that night, now had strong opinions about whether she deserved to spend the rest of her life behind bars. And inside that courtroom, it was a battlefield. Asterisk. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Julia Monroe as a woman who had lost control, a sheriff who had let her badge get to her head, a vigilante who had taken the law into her own hands. The facts are simple. The lead prosecutor, Daniel Kessler, told the jury. She entered that room with a loaded weapon. She didn't fire once. She didn't fire twice. She emptied an entire magazine. 10 bullets. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that's not self-defense. That's rage. He pointed to the autopsy report, the bullet trajectories, the forensic evidence. Ryan Walker was unarmed. He never moved toward her, never lunged, never reached for a weapon. She didn't shoot to stop a threat. She shot to kill. His words hung in the air like a death sentence. And for a moment, the courtroom felt different. Like maybe Julia Monroe wasn't getting out of this. Asterisk. Then it was the defense's turn. Julia's lawyer, Gabrielle Owens, was known for one thing: winning the impossible cases. She stood before the jury, her voice measured, her tone sharp. "Imagine this," she began, pacing the courtroom. "Imagine you walk into your child's room. You see a man, someone you trusted, someone you loved, and he is doing the unthinkable. Now tell me, would you have hesitated?" She let the words sink in. "Would you have stopped to think about the technicalities of the law? Would you have calmly walked out of the room to call the police while your child was being violated? Or would you have done exactly what Julia Monroe did?" Silence. No one spoke, because no one had an answer. Asterisk. Then came the moment that shifted the entire trial. Lily Monroe, just 10 years old, too young to be in a courtroom, too young to understand the weight of what had happened. But there she was, a small girl on the witness stand, her feet barely touching the floor, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The judge asked if she understood what it meant to tell the truth. She nodded. The courtroom was silent. Then came the question. "Lily, can you tell us what happened that night?" She took a breath, deep, steady, and when she spoke, she didn't cry, she didn't tremble. She looked directly at the jury, and with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I was scared, but when Mommy came in, I wasn't scared anymore." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Some people gasped, others wiped away tears, and that's when everything changed. Asterisk. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The entire country held its breath. Would they find her guilty? Would she spend the rest of her life behind bars? News stations ran constant coverage, speculating what the jury would decide. Protesters outside grew louder. The tension was unbearable. Then, finally, the foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hands. Julia didn't blink. Not as the judge called for order. Not as the foreman cleared his throat. Not as he read the words that would determine the rest of her life. In the matter of the state of Florida versus Julia Monroe, a pause. The world stopped. We, the jury, find the defendant. Another pause. Julia's fingers clenched. Not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Some cried. Some yelled in outrage. And Julia? She just sat there, frozen. She was free. But she had lost everything. Asterisk. Julia Monroe never wore a badge again. She was no longer Sheriff Monroe. She was just Julia, the woman who had killed her husband, the woman who had become a national debate. She left Clearwater Shores, not because she had to, but because the town would never see her the same way again. Lily went into therapy, struggling to piece her childhood back together. For years, they lived in the shadows of what had happened. But time, as it always does, moved forward. Lily grew up. Julia found new purpose. She worked as a victim's advocate, helping others find justice in ways she never could. And slowly, pain turned into memory. Memory turned into something they could live with. But the scars? They never faded. Because some choices, some moments, they never leave you. Asterisk. So now we ask you, was Julia Monroe a murderer? Or was she simply a mother who did what she had to do? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you want more gripping true crime stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another case. Because the truth, it's not always what it seems.